Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I am Dr. Meng Yu Wu from Changgung Memorial Hospital in Taiwan. Welcome to join us online in AP ELSO 2021. I'll be the first speaker and the moderator of this section. Today, I will share our experience of ECMO in traumatology with you. I have no conflict of interest to report here. If you are interested in ECMO and can read traditional Chinese, please go to my website via the QR code. I have prepared some ebooks for you. You can also find the book that included most of the slides of today's talk and their Chinese narration. Okay, let's start to explore the predictors of hospital mortality in adult trauma patients receiving ECMO for advanced life support. My talk today is based on the results of my previous studies. You can download them from the journal's website via the corresponding QR codes. As a surgeon, I understand that calling for ECMO support is the last resort for the trauma team, especially during the early period of trauma management. Because every surgeon knows that heparinizing the hemorrhagic patient is sure to induce chaos in coagulation, and ECMO happens to be a heparin-coated circuit. Therefore, putting a trauma patient on ECMO may induce intractable bleeding from the injured parts and cause mortality. Due to the concern and bad experiences of dealing with intractable bleeding in trauma patients, the Trauma Society wants to know exactly the true value of ECMO in supporting trauma patients. Do the benefits outweigh the risks? The meta-analysis included 12 studies and 215 patients in total. At first glance, we could find that the included ECMO patients could have a chance around 50% to survive with the aid of ECMO regardless of the ECMO mode. However, we could not understand what predicts the final survival. The reported parameters indicating the severity of trauma and the incidence of death from bleeding are too diverse to make a concise conclusion. Therefore, we still do not know how to increase the benefit or reduce the risk of ECMO in trauma patients. In Taiwan, ECMO experience has grown quickly in the past decade due to the support of national health insurance. This national cohort study, published in Circulation, reveals that about 40% of the patients receiving ECMO for traumatic ARDS or shock survived. While compared to patients receiving ECMO for coronary disease or infectious disease, this 40% survival is significantly better. Since Changgung Memorial Hospital is a scaled-level I trauma center, we have a relatively substantial experience of ECMO in trauma patients and several publications. In these single-center studies, the only question we asked was, what is the profile of the good candidate for VV and VA ECMO? The survivals of ECMO support are 30% in traumatic shock and 70% in traumatic ARDS in CGMH. Since bleeding and death on ECMO were the focuses of our studies, we needed to figure out the typical coagulation profile of trauma patients supported by ECMO. After reviewing the literature, we found that the patient's coagulation profile should be significantly affected by the severities of trauma-induced coagulopathy, TIC, and ECMO-induced coagulopathy at that time. Here we are focused on the early TIC. It is a hyperfibrinolytic DIC, occurring soon after trauma because of continuous blood loss and shock. This consumptive coagulopathy causes a significant prolongation of the coagulation time. Stop the bleeding, accompanied with blood transfusion, is the only effective solution to this consumptive coagulopathy. The ECMO-induced coagulopathy is also a consumptive coagulopathy caused by blood surface interaction. When the patient's blood is drained into the ECMO circuit, the blood surface reaction will initiate a strong inflammatory reaction, which activates the coagulation cascade. The heparin-coated ECMO circuit is used to mitigate the tendency of clot formation in the patient ECMO circulation. Hours later, an additional heparin supplement is required to maintain a moderate hypocoagulation on ECMO. This plot demonstrates the change of APTT on ECMO with time. The gray bars present the patients without a prolonged coagulation time. Before ECMO cannulation, these patients received a typical heparinization regimen, which included a precannulation dose, a priming dose, and an extra dose of heparin to maintain a moderate hypocoagulation. On ECMO, the white bars present the patients with a prolonged coagulation time before ECMO cannulation. They receive a heparin-minimized regimen, which offers heparin from the heparin-coated circuit only. As shown in the plot, there was a profound hypocoagulation state in all patients at the beginning of ECMO. The hypocoagulation state was reversed after 12 hours in patients with relative normal coagulation before ECMO, but it took longer in patients with a prolonged coagulation time before ECMO cannulation. In our practice, we would order a whole-body CT to rule out internal bleedings in our candidates before deciding to offer ECMO. This slide concludes our heparin management in trauma ECMO. In patients with a significant prolongation of coagulation time before cannulation, we would offer them the heparin-minimized ECMO. We would also give them blood products and drugs to reverse the heparin effect of the heparin-coated circuit. Our concern of hemorrhage on ECMO outweighed the concern of thrombogenesis in ECMO circuit in these patients. There are some reminds when deciding to choose the heparin-free or heparin-minimized ECMO to support the trauma patients. We have heparin-minimized ECMO in Taiwan rather than heparin-free ECMO because the manufacturer did not provide the non-coating one. First, the pump flow should be kept high to prevent stasis. Second, choose the VV ECMO as possible if you want to keep a longer heparin-minimized state, for example, more than 48 hours. The plot explains why VV ECMO is the suitable model for the heparin-minimized regimen. If there is clot formation in the ECMO circuit or in the outflow cannula, the chance of ECMO circuit occlusion or outflow embolization will increase. Compared to VA ECMO, VV ECMO may bring fewer damages to the patient in these scenarios. Traditionally, offering ECMO to support patients with traumatic brain injury is somewhat controversial due to the fear of an intractable ICH on ECMO. We made a small systemic review of published studies reporting ECMO used in patients with TBI. The review included 8 studies with 21 patients in total. Most patients had an ICP monitor, and the mortality was just 5%. Therefore, we might conclude that the heparin-free VV ECMO is relatively safe in TBI patients with an ICP monitor. Finally, we found the independent predictor of hospital mortality and bleeding on ECMO in our cohort with 36 adult trauma patients. The independent predictors of hospital mortality were an injury severity scale more than 35 and receiving ECMO for traumatic shock. The independent predictors of bleeding on ECMO was a prolonged APTT more than 40 seconds before ECMO. A simple risk classification table was made according to the independent predictors of hospital mortality. The predicted mortalities was quite approximate to the observed ones in the 4 classes. According to the table, ECMO support in patients with a severe traumatic shock carries a high risk of becoming a medical futility. Take-home message: ECMO is an art to manage coagulation. The knowledge of ECMO-induced coagulopathy is crucial to increase the benefits and reduce the risks in the ECMO candidates. Finally, thank you for your listening.